Good afternoon, everyone. So we are on lesson 17, and we're still looking at the nutrients in big diets. Today we're looking at carbohydrates. Let's dig into it. Okay, so guys, the carbohydrate group consists of different things. The first one is sugars. Then now plants produces sugars through photosynthesis and so on as an energy source. And when they have more than what they need to grow, they store some for later use and so on. They can store it in leaves, they can store it in fruit or tubers and so on, but they store it in the form of carbohydrates, of starches and so on. So we can say that starch is plant fat, that it's the way plants store their excess energy. And the reason why they're storing that energy is, of course, to one day send their children off, their seeds off into the world with a lunchbox so that they have energy when they land on the ground to put down that primary root to get some water and the first leaf to catch some sunlight so that they can then produce their own carbohydrates to live on. But that they can't go without the lunchbox because they won't get born, basically, they won't get off the ground. So plants, to ensure the survival of the species, store sugars in the form of starch for later use. Animals do have a sort of starch called glycogen, which is sort of sugars in an instant or in a very easily accessible form. It's usually stored in the liver, and it's sort of your nitrous oxide tank. If you're in trouble, that bull has changed you want to jump over a 6-foot fence, then with that extra energy released in a lump in your bloodstream, you can do amazing things and so on. So we stay with the starches. And then the carbohydrate group has got fibers. Now, guys, so sugars, we get some sugars that is in molecules of 1 and some in 2 and some in a few more. But when the plant stores the sugars as starch, they link them in chains of sugars. And these chains can be sort of 300 sugars in a link and so on. But those links are easily broken. We have got the enzymes to break those links to make them back into sugars. Because guys, remember, there's only one sugar in your bloodstream, and that is glucose. So all the other sugars has got to be changed back into glucose before it's available to us for energy. Okay, and we're going to have a look at what they look like just now and see how easy it is to change from glucose to maltose or vice versa and so on. So starches is basically chains of sugars around about the sort of 300 sugars chains long. Fibers, on the other hand, can be thousands, like 10,000 and 100,000 sugars. So you can see that fiber has got huge amounts of energy and so on. The problem is for us as monogastric, we do not have the enzymes to break those bonds because they have a very strong chemical bond that we do not have the enzyme to break, and so on. Now, fibers are mostly the cell walls of plants. So if you take a plant cell and you dehydrate it, so there's no more water, then as a percentage of the dry matter, your cell wall is about 80 or 90% of the dry matter of a plant cell. There's a bit of a protein, mostly in the nucleus, and also the organelles and so on are made of protein. There's a bit of sugar in the cytoplasma. There's maybe a few drops of starch and so on in a typical plant cell. But the majority part of it is made out of fiber. Now, fiber are structural materials and so on. It keeps the plant cells stiff. But if you're thinking about an animal cell, a typical animal cell, of which that your body is one, Now, if I take my arm and I push with my finger there, I can push a bit of a dent. And if I let go, it bounces back again. You try and do that with a tree trunk and you won't have much success and so on. So we can see that plant cells are much more stiff, much more strong. And of course, the higher the plant grows, the more reinforcing it needs to build into its cell to keep that tree upright in huge winds and so on. Okay, so there are different cell wall components, cellulose, hemicellulose, and then there's lignin. Now, lignin is totally undigestible, even to ruminants who's got the bacteria. The bacteria has got the enzymes to break down those chemical bonds in cellulose and hemicellulose and so on, but that not even they can break down lignin. So it's basically the sawdust. You can feed sawdust to cows. They're not going to get fat, or they can't live on that either, and so on. So lignin, totally undigestible, and lignin is the strongest reinforcing that plants build up. The higher they get, the more reinforcing they build up, the less digestible they are, because there's a bigger and bigger percentage of lignin in that plant, and so on. But for us as monogastric and for monogastric digestion and so on, we're going to stick with the sugars and starches and so on. Fibers has a small role to play in monogastric feeding. Remember, we are monogastrics, pigs are monogastric. So what does fiber do for you and me in our diet? It basically keeps us regular, which means that we don't get constipated. So fibers is important in that sense and so on. In pig diets, it is half a problem and half an asset and so on. So for young pigs, creep feed, a weaner feed, a grower feed, you need as little fiber as possible, because the stomach space or the stomach volume is limiting. So you want to put as much nutrients in there and as little fiber as possible, because we can't digest it. But when you get into heavier baconers and dry sows and so on, you've got excess space. You're feeding them less than what their stomach content, stomach volume can take. So their fiber has a role of making them feel satisfied, making them feel full, and so on. So there is a role to play there. But we are going to sort of kick off with sugars and starches and so on. So guys, don't get a fright to structural formulas and so on. I'm not going to ask you to learn this and so on. I just want to give you a basic idea. So guys, firstly, you get monosaccharides. Mono meaning one and saccharide meaning sugar. So one sugars. So it means that there's one sugar molecule in that sugar. So glucose, galactose, mannose, fructose are monosaccharides, and so on. Now you'll see most of these are in the shape of a hexagon, which means it's got 6 points, and so on. And some of them are in the shape of a pentagon, which is 5 points, and so on. Now, so they sort of color-coded these. Then you get deoxyhexagons and so on, which has got more oxygen than the originals and so on. Then pentoses and so on, which is also those 5 point structures and so on. Then you get disaccharides. Now, di meaning 2, and so in groups of 2. And when you have 2 glucoses to put together, it's called maltose. We get multi-glucose, maltose. Sucrose, which is your white sugar that you have on your table and so on for your coffee, that is made up out of a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule. So they stuck together. So basically what they've done there is they knocked one oxygen out, and that sort of the extra arm that's becoming available that one linked with that one there, and so on. So if you have one molecule of fructose and one molecule of glucose bound together, they form sucrose. And lactose, which is milk sugar, has got one galactose and one glucose stuck together. So that if you're eating table sugar and so on, you've got sucrase, which is the enzyme that breaks down sucrose. Remember, I said anything ending with the OSE is a sugar, anything with the ASE is a enzyme. So we've got sucrase, so it will break that little bond quite easy, and so on. And then you've got glucose, which can go straight in your bloodstream. Fructose needs to be changed around a little bit to get into your bloodstream and so on. The same with milk sugar or lactose. If you drink a glass of milk, that glucose can go straight into your bloodstream, and the galactose will follow a bit later and so on after altering. Okay, so these are single molecule sugars, and these are sort of groups of 2 disaccharides. Now, if we're looking at starch, there are 2 kinds of starch. The one is amylose, and the other one's amylopectin, and so on. So your amylose can have up to 1,000 glucose molecules, and they are attached in a straight line. And of course, they are all what kind of sugar? Yes, they are all glucose. So starch is all glucose. Your body's got the amylase, which is the enzyme to break down these bonds. So starch is a very good energy source and so on. So that's amylose, but there's also amylopectin, which can have between 10,000 and 100,000 glucose molecules. So you can see massive amount of energy and so on stored there. It's a bit like a zip file in computer things and so on. You can sort of condense them and stuff more of them in a shorter space, so that they can give you a lot of energy, but it's more in a compact form and so on. And so the other thing about amylopectin, they're not in a straight line. They're sort of branched, the molecule, and again, they are all glucose molecule, but a lot more. It's sort of 1,000 times, or say 10 times more than that, or 100 times more than that. So these 2 are starch. Then your cellulose and so on. Now these guys can be even longer, they are much longer than these ones, over 100,000 sugars stuck together. Again, they are all glucose molecules. But guys, these bonds here are impossible for us as monogastrics to break down. They're actually impossible for any animal to break down. The only things that can break these bonds here are bacteria. They have got the enzyme to break down these chemical bonds, and they can make these things into glucose, which then the cow uses. So strictly speaking, ruminants don't eat grass. They gather grass, they feed it to the bacteria, they wait for the bacteria to poo it out, and they eat the bacteria's excrement and so on, if you think about it that way. Because and the reason why they've got 4 stomachs, 3 of those stomachs is just to do this, to break these things, to house the bacteria, to do this for them, and so on. So that's where that comes from. Okay, so we said starch is the most abundant carbohydrate in nature. It is synthesized and stored for energy for plant growth. It can be stored in the seeds. Okay, eventually it's stored in the seeds. That's what it's making it for. It can also be stored in tubers like potatoes and sweet potatoes and so on, in roots and so on, in stems. Stems, if you think about a prickly pear, the thorns is actually the leaf, and the thing that looks like a leaf in a prickly pear is actually the stem. So that there, the stuff is the carbohydrates is stored in the stem. They can also be stored in the leaves and so on, if you're thinking about speckworm, speckbush and so on, and some fruits and so on, also like bananas and so on, has got starch and so on as well. So we said there are 2 kinds of starch molecules, amylose and amylopectin, and so on. You said the one is 1,000 glucose, and the other one is 10 to 100,000 glucoses. That one is in a straight line. This one is more branched. Now, raw potatoes and green bananas has got this one here, this amylose, and so on. They are more tightly packed granules and more insoluble, which means that they are harder to well, they don't dissolve in water, firstly, and therefore they are also harder to digest. As you know, green bananas and so on isn't as sweet. The riper it gets, the sweeter it gets and so on. But when it's green, it's sort of floury and it's harder to digest. The same with potatoes. We know that you've got to cook raw potatoes before you can feed it to pigs. The same as if you try and eat raw potatoes, you'll only get about a half of the energy that's available in it digested and so on when it's raw and so on. So those raw potatoes and raw bananas or non-ripe tomatoes have got a lot of amylose in it. Corn, wheat, potatoes, and starch and so on contain about 20% of that one and 80% of this one. Okay. So even the potatoes and maize and wheat and those kind of things have got both of them in different proportions and so on. And that will the more of this and the less of that will make it less digestible. When it's got more of these, then it's more digestible and so on. Okay, starch may not always be digestible unless cereal grains are altered physically by processing like grinding and roller milling. So how does roller milling and grinding make it more digestible? Firstly, the particle sizes are smaller, so the enzymes can get around it and can work on it more efficiently than working on the big whole grain and so on. So it's physically changing the processing it and so on, or heating it. When you are pelletizing, we had a pelletizer and so on. When stuff comes out of the pelletizer, it is blistering hot. You cannot bag straight out of the pelletizer because it's very hot. Now, we didn't heat it up. We actually add water before just to bind the stuff a little bit more and so on. So how does it come out blistering hot out of the pelletizer? Because of the friction. It's under huge pressure that pushes meal through a little hole to push out a pellet on the other side. That pressure is so high, the friction is so high that it heats it up and so on. So by pelletizing or expansion or extrusion is also just separating water from it, like you extrude oil from soya and so on. That was also a pressing process, again, pressing, friction, pressure, and heat and so on. And that is, so when they extrude oil from soya mechanically, not extruding it with chemicals which that dissolve fat to get it out. If you're doing it mechanically under pressure, then that creates the heat that kills the anti-nutritional factors that we spoke about in raw soya and other legumes, oil seeds, and so on. So it's sometimes even our cereal grains and so on need processing to make them more digestible because they've also got some of amylose in, which is the less digestible of the two starches and so on. Okay, so that's starch. Now, dietary fiber and so on. So we said that sort of the cell wall part of plant cells and so on. You can define fiber as carbohydrates that is not digestible by enzymes. Okay, so by our enzymes, that are in-body enzymes and so on. You can add enzymes outside of the body and so on, but that in the animal, the enzymes that's there, if they can't digest it, then it's classed as fiber. Okay, so common feed ingredients rich in fiber is things like barley, wheat, and oats, and so on. So maize has got a lot less fiber than barley, wheat, and oats. If you've seen a wheat plant growing, the seed is sort of a seed head, and it's got a whole lot of little seeds around a central thingy, and each one of them has got sort of a big wing and so on, but it's got a crusty capsule that's covering leaves and so on, and so the fiber content is much higher than maize. We'll look at fiber content, protein, energy, all of these things in the next lesson as well. We're going to go right into the nutrient layout and so on. These are the grains, but also their co-products, the things that come off from processing them. When you make maize meal, you do not want the little shell. You want to take that off, and then you've got maize bran. If you want to make flour, white flour, not brown flour or whole wheat flour type things, then you've got to take the little crust off just to have the white starchy bit on the inside. So there are things that come off in the form of bran and so on. Also, distillers, grains and so on, once they distill it, to make alcohol, you need starch, which they then feed to yeast. The yeast turn the starch into sugar, and of course, then they turn it into alcohol. But if you feed if you're feeding a grain and it's taken the starch out, then you've got a higher percentage of germ and so on. So those distillers grains and so on add protein to it and so on. Also, your canola meal, which is a root, and wheat mill run and so on. So this is sort of a mixture of the bran plus finer particles of wheat that they couldn't separate and so on. So it's not pure bran. It's got a little bit, so you'll see in the analysis of it and so on, it's got a bit higher energy than bran because it's got a bit of starch. The process of doing it is less efficient in recovering all the starch and so on. Okay, generally your digestible fiber includes cell wall components like cellulose and hemicellulose and other structural and non-structural components. So that makes up the dietary fiber. The utilization of dietary fiber in pigs and poultry depends on, firstly, the fiber content. The more fiber, the higher the percentage of fiber, the less digestible it is. The degree of microbial fermentation in the large intestine, of course, we said in the pigs, there's a little bit of fermentation in the large intestine, very little in domesticated pigs on concrete and so on. If you've got pigs on outside system and so on, or you've got wild pigs, then there might be a little bit more fermentation going on. The cecum will be enlarged and so on. But in pigs, in a piggery, commercial piggery and so on, they don't need that. The food is all digested because it's milled and so on before it gets to the large intestine and so on. Okay. So of course, here, thinking of horses and so on, there will be a large degree of fermentation in the large intestine, less so in pigs and so on. Very little in the humans because our cecum is our appendix. It's not used. It's a little thing that size. Okay, and also, of course, the extent of absorption and other factors and so on. So how much of those fermented volatile fatty acids is the end product of the fermentation, even in the cecum. That's also the end product of fermentation in the rumen. But we said in the pig, the bit that is formed isn't even absorbed. It's sort of used locally in the cell, in the gut lining cells and so on. So it's sort of used locally, very little available in the rest of the body and so on. Okay. So going to cellulose and so on again. So we said those bonds are called 1,4 beta bonds and so on. Impossible for us as monogastrics to break. And of course, these are all glucose molecules and so on. So we said cellulose is the major component in the rigid cell walls of plants. Remember, animal cells have got a cell membrane, which is a thin thingy, like a balloon type thing. But the cell wall is the hard, crusty bit on the outside. And we said that makes up the major part of a cell, of a plant cell and so on. So we said cellulose has got a linear polysaccharide, which means it's stitched together in a straight line with many glucose molecule units and so on. The actual linkage sorry, the acetyl linkage is a beta link, which is this is called a beta link, which is much more difficult to break and impossible for humans and so on. The only thing that can do it is bacteria. So we are totally unable to digest cellulose because of these. We do not have the enzymes to break it down. Okay, indigestible cellulose is the fiber which aids in the smooth working of the intestinal tract. Guys, it's a so that I'm saying fiber is a bad thing in grower pigs and so on, but it's also it has got a function in keeping your intestinal tract working properly. There's a joke about the different organs of the body arguing which is the most important, and the anus didn't take part in this discussion. It just stopped working, and in 2 weeks, everyone agreed that that was the most important organ in the body. Okay, sorry about that. So the thing is with fiber, guys, it is bulky. It's bulky. If you have a bag of feed, you buy bags of feed, it's sort of 50 kilograms in a bag. If you've emptied it out and you put bran in there, you can barely get 40 kilograms of bran or fiber, fiber-rich bran in that same bag. So it's bulky, it's got a bigger volume and so on. It also takes up a bigger volume in the stomach, which means there can be less nutrients in the stomach at any one time, or in the digestive tract at any one time. So when you've got limited space, like in small pigs and so on, very bad thing and so on. It is totally indigestible to pigs and humans. It takes longer to move through the digestive system. So it doesn't just take up more space, it also moves slower through. So there's less, the slower it moves, the less refills you can have per day, and it brings down your total daily intake down, which means your growth rate is going down, which means your money making is going down, and so not a good thing at all. Okay, it helps to prevent, on the positive side, helps to prevent constipation in sows just before and just after farrowing. It's a major problem with sows, that constipation and so on. Look out for it. We discussed it in the health topic and so on, where we discussed metabolic disorders and so on. If you haven't been there yet, go back to that. Also makes the sows feel full and satisfied. We said a lactating sow can eat 7-8 kilograms of food, but when she's not lactating, we feed her 2.5 kilos. So she can eat more. She's, I'm still hungry. Yeah, she gets enough for her needs, but she is still feeling hungry. So if you can get high fiber ingredients at the right price, you can feed them more of it. Instead of feeding them 2.5 kilos, feed them 4 kilos if the price allows it, and so on. So that's an option, and it will make her feel satisfied and restful and so on as well. Okay, so now we're going to look at carbohydrates and providing energy from them and so on. We spoke about fats, and we said that they are very concentrated energy contents and so on, with up to between 2.25 and 3 point something times more energy per kilogram of fat than there is in carbohydrates and so on. But there's very few plants that's got a lot of fat in it, except for our oil seeds. Okay, we are now using the oil seeds or the oil cakes, which is after the oil has been removed and so on. So the bulk of the energy is coming from carbohydrates. We can add extra oil for specific purposes in our creep feeds and in our lactating diets and so on. But the bulk in a normal feed is coming from carbohydrates. Okay. Now, guys, there are different ways of expressing energy and so on. Just like there's different ways of expressing length. You can say millimeter or meter or L or chain or kilometers and so on, or miles. They are all different measurements of distance. So energy, we measure in different ways too. The first one is gross energy. Now, when they measure gross energy for a feed or for something, what they do is they put it in a bomb calorimeter. Basically, what they're doing is they burn it and they measure how much heat comes from it. Now, guys, if you take a log of wood and you burn it, and you take a kilogram of maize meal and you burn it, you will get about the same gross energy content. So not a good tool for us to distinguish between good feed and bad feed and so on. So gross energy, not fit for purpose and so on. The second way that we can express energy and so on is digestible energy. Now, digestible energy is basically what goes in there minus what comes out the back end. If you're feeding a cow 10 kilograms of hay and 3 kilograms comes out the back end, you know the digestibility is 70% and so on. Now, that's a lot better and so on, but there are other losses as well, except for feces. There are still energy in the urine, which we haven't taken into account yet. There is still energy in the gases that they expel. A cow produces about 300 liters of methane every day. Now, methane is biogas. If you know anything about biogas, and you know you can run a petrol engine from it. So if gases leaves the cow, that can still run a petrol engine, it is not burnt out all the carbon in it. There is still energy left in it. So if you take digestible energy and you subtract the amount of energy that's still left in the urine, and you take off the energy that's left in gases and so on, then you've got metabolizable energy. So this is now getting better and better, okay? So metabolizable energy, this is actually the one we're going to be using and so on. There are another layer, and we'll talk about that just now and so on. But the measurement we're going to be using in ration balancing is metabolizable energy. So the ultimate, of course, is net energy, netto, the final product and so on. But the problem is that net energy, the last thing that you have to deduct to get all the losses out, so you know exactly how much is left to produce milk, meat, work, and so on, is heat. Now, heat is firstly difficult to measure and so on. It's also variable. It varies with high energy, low energy diets. It varies with a whole lot of different things. It's very difficult to measure. So the reason we're not going with the ultimate, we're not going with net energy, is that it's too variable and too hard and too expensive to measure or to work out and so on. Metabolizable energy is it's 90% there, but it's a lot easier to measure. So that's why we're going with ME instead of net energy and so on. So from now on, we're going to look at energy in the form of metabolizable energy. So the digestible energy and metabolizable energy systems have been most widely used and so on. Actually, the database that we're going to use for our feed ingredients give both of them in most cases and so on. The only time that you would not be using ME is when you're working with roughages, like in dairy or in ruminant feeds and so on, or high fiber diets and so on. Then you can work on total digestible nutrients and so on, which is a different way of measuring energy, but it doesn't just measure energy. It also takes the energy that you can get from proteins and from fats. So it's sort of a combination thing, not just energy. But for our purposes, for pig diets, we're going to be working on ME. Okay, and as we said, that we're going to measure this metabolizable energy in megajoules. And we said a joule is equal to the energy that it takes to lift 1 kilogram, 1 meter in 1 second. So a megajoule is a million that's wrong. Sorry, that's a million of them, not a. So a kilojoule is 1,000 joules. a megajoule is a million joules. Sorry about that. As a definition of joules and so on. So I'll fix that later. Sorry. So again, just as we said, digestible energy is what goes in the front minus what comes out the back. And so it measures what stays in the body. But of course, we said there are other losses and so on, urine, gas coming out from burps and farts, and so on. And the last one is, of course, the heat production of the body and so on. And we also said that fiber moves slower through the system. It takes longer, it's bulky, it takes up more space. So all of these two things make less energy available to the animal and so on. So let's take this example here. So this is a 70% digestible food. So that's sort of on the high side and so on. And let's say it takes 6 hours to digest. If it takes its stomach is full, it takes 6 hours to digest it before you can eat again and so on. So it means that if he's been fed 10 kilos, he's getting 7 kilos retained in the body. And in a day, you can have 4 refills. So in a day, you can get 28 kilos of digestible energy. Now, when you're feeding a low digestible feed, it's usually low digestible because it's got more fiber in and less more soluble energy sources like sugars and starch and so on, and less grains and so on. So let's say you got a 50% digestible food, but now it takes 8 hours to digest it before you can take in the next lot of food. So now in a day, he's only got 3 refills, and 50% from 10 kilos is only 5 kilos that's retained in the body. So he gets 5 kilos per refill, and he gets 3 refills in a day. So in a day, he gets 15 kilos of digestible energy. So you can see when you're feeding low digestible feeds, you get a double whammy. You get less per mouthful and less mouthfuls in a day, and so on. So you can see between 50 and 70, the 70 is almost double the digestible energy available to the animal than a 50% digestible feed. Excuse me. Okay, so guys, we're going to look at different feed sources and so on, and we are going to look sort of classify them in feeds that has high energy, low energy, high fiber, low fiber, and so on. So here we're looking at gross energy. That's what we started with, and then we subtracted fecal energy, and that gave us digestible energy. So they reckon if you started with 18.4 megajoules of gross energy, by the time you've lost 0.5 megajoules and so on, you're getting sort of 0.85 megajoules. So it's come down quite a bit. Then you subtract the urine energy and the methane energy and so on. Then you're left with metabolizable energy. And then the last one for net energy is that net energy, of course, is used for maintenance, for growth, for lactation, for pregnancy. So that's what the energy that's now left in the body to be used. It's used for those things. But each one of those has got a heat increment. It takes heat to break down food for maintenance, for growth, for lactation, and so on. Each one of them loses heat. And these heat things it will vary against how many piglets they're carrying and so on, or how much milk they produce. So it's too variable to quantify. These things here, how did we quantify the amount of energy that comes off urine and feces and so on? Of course, they did that over the last 50 years in metabolic crates and so on. At Massey University and so on, we had a whole unit, the animal production unit, that was still doing, at that stage, look at this, is 35 years ago, they were still doing metabolic crates and so on, where they put a pig in, they weigh off food to the fourth decimal, they put it in, they weigh anything that's spilled, they weigh the amount of feces, they weigh the amount of urine, and they do these calculations. Then once they got all that data, they put that into a computer model. So these days we don't do a lot of metabolic crates anymore. We've got the trends set, and we can predict very accurately what will happen if we do this and feed it that and use this size pig and so on. So we've done those things. That's how we got these things here. But as I said, these things here are too variable, too difficult to measure. That's why we're using ME. Okay, sorry. So yeah, they took a feed that had with an energy intake of 19.1 megajoules. The fecal energy was 7.4. The urinary losses were 0.7. The methane was 1.3. The heat loss was 3.4 in this case, and so on. And so your gross energy was that original one. Your digestible energy is just that one minus that one. So you started with 19. Now digestible, you only got 11.7 left. By the time you're looking at ME, you got 9.7 left. So you lost 2 there, you lost 7 and a bit there, and so on. When you're looking at net energy, you actually got 5.9 left. So you've lost another 3.8 there, and so on. Now, the heat loss and so on, they work on a constant value, and this is the one that's up and down and variable and so on. So, yeah, you can see that working with gross energy has got absolutely no use. Digestible energy is reasonable. Metabolic energy is much better. Any would have been perfect, but it's just too hard to calculate and so on. Okay, so we're going to use all of that in our next bit, which is looking at each ingredient, like maize and wheat and barley and sorghum and so on. We're going to do the whole spectrum of energy, protein, the minerals, the vitamins, the amino acids, everything of those things. Then once we know our ingredients, we know what nutrients they have in them, and we know what these nutrients do in the body, and so on. Then we're going to look at what the animal needs at different stages and so on. And then we're going to balance the ration so that the stuff that we're giving it fills 100% all the needs of the pig on the other end. Okay, so that's where we're heading. We've come quite a bit of a way, but we're getting towards the end line now. So have a great day and see you in the next lesson. Have a good one. Thank you.